I think we shall get started. Please, everybody, if you would come into the room and sit down, we would like to get started. Time is precious. And I'd like to start the panel soon. So please come in and sit down. Welcome, everybody, to this NATO panel. My name is Jana. I'm a senior policy fellow with ECFR in Berlin and head the Berlin office. And it's my great pleasure to moderate today's discussion. I think it has been such a long time that we weren't able to talk to each other in person, to exchange views, not only on a screen, but in person, that we see each other. So I think we should really make the best of it. So I will spare you any lengthy introductory remarks. I think the panel description is quite clear in the program, straightforward, and I want to dive deeply into many specific issues and actually make best use of the limited time we have. So let's get started with the discussion right away. I'll briefly introduce my distinguished panel. I do it in alphabetical order, and I start with the General Rajmund Andrzejczak, Chief of the General Staff of the Polish Armed Forces, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. Next to me is Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy of NATO, Ambassador Baiba Braže.
Good to be here.
On my very left is Philippe Errera. He is Director General for Political and Security Affairs, Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs of France. And to my very right is JJ Green, coming to us from the United States. He is a national security correspondent with a WTOP radio station. So welcome, everybody, and thank you very much for making it. We start this panel with short introductory remarks. I would like to give every participant the opportunity to reflect on one of the questions that was outlined in the panel description. What kind of alliance do we need in the coming decade? Because I think it is quite clear that since the last strategic concept was written in 2010, where Russia was considered a partner and China wasn't even mentioned, we've moved on quite a bit. We are at the beginning of a process to write the new strategic concept for a new NATO. And I think since the last one was written, a lot has happened, not only vis-à-vis China and Russia. NATO was declared brain dead by some. Others declared, or others were, I think, an inch short of leaving NATO. We have entered an era of great power competition and just ended a military intervention in Afghanistan with what I would call a pretty disastrous withdrawal, with maybe a little coordination among allies. So looking at this overall picture, so what do you think are the big strategic decisions when it comes to NATO's new strategic concept, the direction NATO should take? How should NATO adapt? How should it reinvent itself? Or is it even necessary to reinvent itself? What can we keep? And what fundamental trends do you see that one needs to respond to? And I start with the General and ask you to keep it concise and
thank you very much indeed.
Sharp and brief.
Short or sharp?
Both. Short and sharp.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, the big pleasure and honor for me to be here because of the timing and because of the location.
Thank you.
We are in the Tallinn, which is the most forward position of the eastern flank facing eastern direction. So we have a planned of discussion with the General Horam, which is my counterpart, Chief of Defense and Southern Armed Forces, about the military solutions for the problem. And it's a very important location here. We are in the eastern flank. So whatever we say, whatever we act, it's important. And the timing is also very important. I was asking myself, what does it mean once we're exercising past and once we're exercising today and the future? So past, it means bipolar, easy, black and white, 0, 1 word. Soviet Union and the United States for a pretty long time. NATO, 70 years old institution. That's the context. And then the last 20 years, fighting terrorism with the spectacular, situation we see in our headlines, a couple of days. That's the today. And how about the future? So without proper understanding what will really happen last 70 years or 20 years or 10 years, and significant decisive points will be very risky to say how we see the future. From my perspective, being a Chief of Defense Polish Armed Forces, sitting in my chair, when I'm looking in a map, it's a very national-oriented thoughts. And also looking in the region, starting from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, down to the Black Sea through the Carpathian Line, Romania. But in the same time, we have a situation in Afghanistan. We have a situation in the Belarusian-Polish border and respective countries like Latvia and Lithuania. So today's crisis. And we have Zapad exercise, the huge message using military instruments of power by Russia. And that's the today, and probably this is a start point for today's discussion. From my perspective, 70 years, 20 years, Tallinn here, Estonia, and the 3 points on the globe right now, that's the today, and that's the biggest point of our discussion today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That was very concise and quick and sharp.
I hope sharp enough.
Baiba, you're next. So what should we think of when we think of the future of NATO?
I think first let me thank our Estonian hosts, and both in terms of organizing the actual conference in person, but also for being such a committed ally. It's not only about 2% plus defense spending, but also your everyday contribution to NATO's debates, to military, to hybrid understanding, to cyber, to everything that you do. Thank you. It's important for NATO, it's important for the alliance, it's important for the region and for each and every one of us. And through that also, we clearly see that that is what NATO is about. In the NAC room, as Philippe will remember, we have another Latin saying that I don't see in the program today, which is animus in consulendo liber, which I think French will have quite a number of translations for that, but when I interpret it in my personal capacity, it means that the spirit of consultation through a free discussion lives on, and this is what NATO is about. You have that exchange, that understanding, you develop common perception and assessment of threats on the basis of the values and what NATO is about. It's just 14 articles in the NATO treaty. As the Omaha congressman said, it's even the milkman should understand it. And it has changed. NATO has changed. When you read through 1948, 1949, when NATO was established, it was actually to deter Germany. It was not against Soviet Union, as some have stated. It was entirely different purpose of the alliance. And through crisis, through this free consultation, through the open exchange and developing the common understanding of threats and action, how to deter and defend, if necessary, whether it's Suez or whether it's Western Berlin and the wall, or certain individuals in offices. It's how alliance has moved ahead. And we will move ahead. Of course we are reeling from Afghanistan, but let me remind you, we shouldn't be surprised of the decision that was taken. We should have listened to the American leaders. They clearly indicated where they stood. Of course, and it was a training alliance. It was not a crisis management or anti-terrorism operation for NATO. It was a training exercise at the end. It was a training mission. And the fact that allies were able to evacuate so many Afghans, so many of our people, and the way how we saw that commitment also shows we can deliver. Like we saw during this COVID crisis, where the military delivered for the civilians, for the medics, and for all of us. So this is what NATO is about. It's not only about allies together among 30, but it's also civilian military cooperation is political military alliance, and I have no doubt we will go through crisis and crisis for the future, and we will fill the core tasks with a new meaning for the strategic concept. We are starting literally in the NAC, and we will reach out to the both establishments, the private sector, to military, to formulate the strategic concept where 30 heads of government and state of government can agree.
Thank you, Baiba. Over to Philippe. Philippe, France has a special interest, I think, in getting this right, since, I mean, we need to overcome NATO's brain dead. So from a French perspective, what would be priorities when you look at the process ahead of us and the renewal of NATO's tasks?
Thank you very much, Jana. And like Baiba, let me say how glad I am to be here, not only in the conference, not only in Tallinn, but in this gathering for reasons that I think the Estonian president made clear in a very powerful, and I found on a personal basis, very moving way last night in her speech. I think I would agree with much of what has been said, but I would take a step slightly back. First, in terms of looking, if we want to look forward for the next 10 years, which is what we'll need to decide on in the next strategic concept, we can't focus only on what's happened in the last 10 or 20 days and Afghanistan. We'll come back to it, I'm sure, but need to look at what's happened in the last 10 years. And second, I think that NATO is not operating in a vacuum, nor should it operate in a vacuum. And that's why this is the subject of the panel, and discuss what NATO should do. But NATO is first and foremost the countries that make it up and the political will they have to operate together. And I think that's the way we would look at it from a French perspective. So I would say very, very simply, and trying to keep in the limited time you asked us to work in at the beginning, if we look at the key changes over the last 10 years, I would just mention 5 of them, and I think it's from these that we need to go to how we will best address them. First, obviously, and this is maybe the last 6 or 7 years, where it's been the most clear, Russia as a destabilizing force on the European continent. Second, I would say the increasing saliency of new domains of conflict, or new domains that are used for conflict, such as cyber, such as space, and which are more tricky to articulate with traditional NATO missions and means, but which we can't ignore. Third, the persistence and the risk of resurgence of terrorism and of a terrorist threat on our homelands. Afghanistan has some bearing on this, but we should not forget what is happening in Iraq and Syria and for Daesh more broadly. And then the 2 last ones I would mention, and which I imagine will be a subject of discussion and perhaps a debate or contention, don't have to do with what's happening outside of NATO, but with what's happening inside NATO. And one, I think, is what I believe to be the confirmation of a lasting shift of the United States' posture away from exposure and military exposure and intervention from areas that are not considered fundamental to US strategic security interests. And many of these areas, especially on our eastern border, are fundamental to European security and strategic interests. So the question is, how do we reconcile this, what I think is a long-term shift that does not date from the Biden administration nor the Trump administration, with the need to keep NATO vibrant? And second, I will not say this is a shift, but we have seen, at least during the Trump administration, that the US commitment to allies, to alliances, and to security guarantees is not necessarily a given. And therefore, how do we live with this reality without comforting this trend deep in the US body politic in some areas, which I think would not be in our interest, but also without ignoring it? And I think the other element that we need to deal with is precisely, as Baiba put it very, very clearly, the need to be able to have substantive debates and to be able to reconcile cohesion and unity in execution, cohesion and unity in the way we are perceived by our adversaries, our competitors, and our partners, with the need to have deep debate, even when the issues are uncomfortable. And this is what President Macron referred to when he mentioned, when he used the terms that were very problematic in terms of the reaction that were seen as problematic, brain dead. We have fundamental shifts. We cannot just sweep the elephant under the rug. Otherwise, there comes a point where you can't walk in the room anymore. And I think what we've been able to do effectively with the experts group, the proposals put forward at the summit, working toward the strategic concept, is reconcile this need to have the hard debates, the difficult debates, and reinforce our unity. You mentioned China. I think China is clearly one of, if not the most, the strongest changes in our strategic, or in the international environment. I don't think that it can be handled, or it should be handled, in the same way as other threats or challenges in our vicinity, because it is not yet a military threat to the Euro-Atlantic area, and therefore NATO cannot have the same approach to it. I do think that NATO can and should be used as a transatlantic security forum for situational awareness to better understand the impact of China's evolving posture on our security. But the truth is that the bulk of the tools that China uses to try to divide us, to weigh on us, to intimidate us, at this stage for Europe are less military than having to do with the instrumentalization or the weaponization of economic and technological interdependence.
We come to that also later in the discussion. We have a deep dive into the China issue later. Thank you very much, Philippe. JJ, you've already heard some remarks about the United States, but from kind of your American perspective and what you observe, how is the NATO debate in your country unfolding? And I hope everybody hears me now. There were some issues. So if you don't, make yourself, I don't know, visible and complain to the organizers, not to me.
Well, thank you again for the opportunity to be here. As someone who's been privileged to be a witness to history, I can say that change is inevitable. And from a journalistic point of view, I want to say that change may be inevitable, but the way we respond is not. And I think where NATO is at this point, it's at a moment of change. And I want to just relate a quick story, being that witness to history, because talking to you as a journalist with this distinguished panel, it's imperative that I speak from a journalist perspective. It was just about 20 years ago that I was standing on the roof of the Voice of America building, watching the Pentagon burn. In the distance, I could see the smoke rising. Just across the street from the VOA building, not more than 100 yards away, was the US Capitol, which we later learned that day was supposed to be the fourth target of those hijackers. Brave people gave their lives so that wouldn't happen. Later that day, I was able to walk down one of the busiest streets in Washington, the middle of the street, Independence Avenue, in September. Everybody's back from vacation, Congress is in session, people visiting. I mean, it's a very busy day. Independence Avenue was a ghost town. The only vehicles there were military vehicles, and there were military people with guard dogs watching. The images of people dying that day were horrific. That day as well, there was a lot of despair in America. The only safe place in America that day was in the air. And there was only one plane in the air that day after those 4 planes crashed, and that was Air Force One. For 8 hours, there was only one plane in the sky because that was the safest place in America. As that day unfolded and the events of the next few months unfolded, Afghanistan happened. A few months after that, the world community, NATO, was there for the US. NATO was there on 9/11 because shortly after it happened, there was a very clear understanding made to the US that Article 5 would apply. NATO was there. Being embedded in Afghanistan with the military over a period of years for 3 times, I've seen the Polish, I've seen the British, I've seen the Germans, I've seen the entire NATO family at work in Afghanistan. And I can say to you, being again that witness to history, there was no greater form of solidarity to me than that, coming to the aid of a member in that way. The US was on its knees on 9/11. It was NATO that extended the hand to help the US stand up. Never in my lifetime did I think I would, again, as this witness what took place a couple of weeks ago. We thought the Taliban were done. We thought that whole process was finished as it relates to Afghanistan. We thought a government would be stood up. We thought Afghanistan would stand on its own. That wasn't the case. Perhaps it was never meant to be. But NATO was there at the very end. When the US left, US troops left, NATO was still there. NATO is still there today. In my opinion, Afghanistan is going to change everything. How things happen, how cooperation takes place, the politics of it, the importance of it, the threats as a result of Afghanistan that were exposed, some that we knew about, some that we didn't expect. As a journalist and as a witness to history, the way it's been handled has been something to behold. From inside the United States, there's been a lot of concern about why certain steps were taken and why certain steps were not taken. Again, change is inevitable, but the way it's handled is not. And this is the thing from a journalistic point of view that I think is going to be with us for quite a while.
JJ, may I interrupt you? And we stay with Afghanistan, we stay with the topic. It's the first topic I wanted to dive a bit deeper in. But I want to ask you concretely, because you made me think when you said Afghanistan changes everything. So my concrete question before you continue would be, does it change American security and defense policy? Does it change America's engagement also with allies?
Wow. I had this all scripted, and I had a big dramatic finish. So I will just put that aside and answer your question. Yes. But more specifically,
I think we are interested in the details,
yes.
especially as Europeans.
Yes, more specifically, the US has some work to do internally. I mean, I think that has been pretty clearly broadcast in the last couple of weeks. I don't think it's going to be easy work because I don't do politics. I just stick with national security, foreign policy, policy issues, but not the political sphere. But I do have to watch it to understand how to interpret what's taking place. There is another situation that's unfolding in Washington where there is stress, there is strife. The Biden administration has been under significant pressure, both from Democrats and from Republicans and from the public as well, who don't understand. I have several friends that I made in Afghanistan who have been calling me every day, help me get out. Tell your government to help me get out. Tell whoever you can to help me get out. I've communicated to the degree that I'm able to those concerns to folks that I know in the government, not trying to get involved in that. I think they have a very fundamental problem that it's going to require some change, Jana. And where that change comes, whether it's in who does what, who listens to who says what, who has the power, I think those are some of the changes that may be coming very soon. Okay,
but coming back to the ally question, there was a lot of criticism amongst allies that the United States did not consult enough. The Trump administration did not consult. The Europeans basically didn't expect anything else. But when Biden came into office, I think with the announcement America was back, we thought also, yeah, back to its commitment to work with allies. And would you say, as a journalist, and last question to you, then I open it up to the others, that there were mistakes made when it comes to consulting with allies? Do you think the US could have done better? Or do you think, as Baiba has said in the very beginning, we Europeans should also have, we should have expected this to happen? And it's maybe, I mean, you didn't say that, but it's maybe a bit lame now from us to complain and to put all the blame on the Americans. So what do you think?
I certainly think it could have been communicated better, what they were planning, what they were doing, and explained better. Now, whether or not it could have been managed or done differently, because we heard the president say several times that this was going to be messy, regardless of when it happened and how, who was involved. But some disagree, and the allies have, I think, every single right to be upset and angry about it, because that's what NATO is about. It's a team, it's a family. And it wasn't clear that that was the way in which this was handled. Feeling blindsided, I've heard that from a few folks from the ally community. And just as a journalist, again, I don't want to inject myself into this as some all-knowing figure who can speak to policy and et cetera. I'm just telling you what I, as a witness to history, have heard and seen. The allies are upset. They should be, and there are reasons why. There were mistakes made, but the biggest one, in my opinion, is the way in which things are communicated. I don't think the administration itself realized until very late in the process that that was something that should have been done a lot better from the very beginning. What was happening and how?
Thank you. Maybe I come to you, Baiba, because you have been witnessing the discussions also inside NATO amongst allies, maybe mumbling in the corridors about what the Americans did, right or wrong. So what is your perception now? What is basically NATO's main takeaway from this Afghanistan mission past 20 years, but especially also this withdrawal and how it was made? Is there a lasting damage?
I mean, there is already, we have started the lessons learned process, and there will be things that worked, that didn't work, and that we can fix, or maybe not. So in that respect, it really does not make sense to put blame on one or the other or third party. We do have to draw lessons nationally and as the alliance, which we will do. Then the next step, of course, is to remember that the alliance has its three core tasks: deterrence, defense, crisis management, cooperative security. And those tasks remain as relevant as ever. And as Philippe rightly said, of course, the new domains of contention, the new domains that also NATO has recognized as operational domains, be it cyber or space, and the tech introduces entirely new meaning into what defense deterrence in the future is and will be. And I'm sure General can come in with his thoughts about that. And the challenge, again, whether it's a certain perception of China and what China is doing in terms of not only the tech development and its treatment of people's data or privacy, but also the actual military capabilities that is developing from missiles, from nuclear to conventional to sea capabilities, Navy, everything is there. And we need to understand what does it mean for the 30 allies. And that's why we have also invited China to a dialogue. Today there is a Weapons of Mass Destruction conference ongoing in Copenhagen. China is not there. And we need China to engage. We need China to be also part of that sort of, if not dialogues, then at least exchange of information to understand. Because otherwise, without that, of course, we will conclude certain things that we conclude. And if that brings more stability or security, that's the next step. But again, Afghanistan, yes, we are all reeling from it. There has to be a rational lessons learned process. And we will do that. We all had scenarios in place. Why, certain scenarios worked, didn't work? That's the next question. So it's a rational, both military political process. But the alliance, as with its 3 core tasks there, and the deterrence and defense as its first one, as we also see from NATO's presence in Estonia, in Latvia, in Poland, in Lithuania, in the south, it's there. It's efficient.
Can I come back to the 3 core tasks enshrined in the 2010 strategic concept? I'm wondering about the future of crisis management, honestly. I mean, you said the end of Afghanistan after 2015 is not a crisis management operation, but a training operation. But still, I mean, is there not intervention fatigue within NATO, deeply widespread amongst European and American allies? And maybe I ask you just straightforward, do you think that NATO will engage in any sort of Afghanistan-style military mission in the near to distant future? Is there any appetite?
You wouldn't want me to speculate, would you? The truth is, again, also about Afghanistan, 9/11, as JJ said, it was a very clear commitment, Article 5. Allies went in together. It was a very clear operation of not allowing threats against the allies to be launched from Afghanistan territory. It was achieved. There hasn't been attacks from Afghanistan territory. Of course, I mean, at the height of our presence, we had more than 150,000. When General Allen was commanding ISAF, it was 150,000 military there. Now, as a training mission, we had less than 12,000. And it was a proper training mission. Yes, we were investing a lot, and we were in it together, and we have changed Afghanistan. 20 years of presence has allowed the whole generation of Afghans to grow up in peace. How can that not change the country? So, for the future, the way how Afghanistan will be run, what relationship will be, it would be a speculation now to sort of imagine, but there will be certain requirements that the allies will expect from whatever rulers they are.
So you think that crisis management will remain one of the 3 core tasks?
It cannot not remain, because again, we saw during the COVID that the allied military was one of the main responders.
So maybe coming to you, Philippe, what are the French lessons looking at Afghanistan first when it comes to basically NATO as a crisis management actor, but also coming back to that training aspect? I mean, looking at the result in Afghanistan, that training mission wasn't really successful, I would say. I mean, I don't know if it was the right strategy to train and equip Afghan soldiers after what we've seen recently. Oh, maybe it was. You tell me whether it was and whether just how we did it was wrong. But because something obviously went wrong. So what are the French lessons looking at basically this? But maybe you want also comment on JJ's remarks about the United States and being that there was a lack of consultation process, maybe.
Sure. So first, I will try. It's difficult. I'm French. But I will try to do this with a great deal of humility. First of all, because I don't think we should judge our action over the last 20 years over what's happened in the last 20 days. The end is a disaster, you use this term. I think this is certainly the way it's seen everywhere by our adversaries, whether it be great power adversaries, whether it be terrorist groups in our societies. But if you start moving back, when did we individually or collectively take the wrong turn? I think it's very difficult to say. Was it in February 2020 when the US made this agreement as opposed to another one with the Taliban? Was it back in 2006, 2007 when we decided as NATO to extend the area of responsibility beyond Kabul? Was it when we decided to move from more counterinsurgency to counterterrorism? And retrospectively, there's sometimes a temptation to conflate solidarity, counterterrorism, NATO coming to the assistance of the US, but there was a year and a half between the moment when, indeed, not at the US's initiative, but certainly with the US welcoming it, we invoked Article 5 for the first time in its history. September, of course, 2001. But it was only in 2003 that NATO, as such, took on a mission in Afghanistan. And the mission was not counterterrorism. The mission was simply to provide continuity of headquarters for the International Security and Assistance Force, a UN force. So, long way of saying, if you revisit this, you need to look at the whole process. And I think, as Baiba said, it would be very important to have a lessons learned process that is neither a blame game nor a whitewash, because otherwise it will be very detrimental. Then, in terms of the more specific questions on how we could have made better choices. So no, not which ones would have been better at what point, but how we could have made them. I think here that there is a shared responsibility in not having used NATO for what it should be, which is a place where we can openly put the questions, even the hard questions, especially the hard questions on the table, and not be satisfied with insufficient answers to the hard questions. And I say shared because indeed it was a surprise to nobody that the United States was, that there was the August 31st deadline. But the truth is that in terms of assessing the reality of the Afghan political, the sustainability of the Afghan political system after this withdrawal, the reality of the Afghan security forces' strength, there was one vision which we know was not accurate. We made, on a national basis, the assessment early in the year that we would not be able to ensure the security of the French community, nor of those Afghans which depended on us for their security and whom we had a debt to beyond the month of July. And we started our evacuation effort in May. What was supposed to be the last flight out was in July. We, of course, then came back in through solidarity, mainly with our other partners, mainly with the Afghans. Close to 2,800 of the 3,000 people we evacuated were not French. So it's not a question of solidarity, but it is a question of acting on the conclusions that you draw, although, of course, we did not imagine that it would be so sudden. So I think in other theaters, we do need to make a better job. And in terms of the better job of living up to the motto, which is in the council room. And I've sat through many of the discussions on Afghanistan where I looked at that motto and thought that there was a disconnect. And it's not always in the council room. It can also be bilaterally, of course. Then, just to come back very quickly to your question on crisis management and training, I think the question on training and equipping partner forces is a key one. It's also a key one for the European Union, where the bulk of its crisis management operations have to do with partner training. I think what Afghanistan has shown is that the center of gravity of the effort and its success or failure is not about how much equipment, how much money, the quality of the training. It's about what the Estonian president last night called the posture, the moral posture, the fact that the people you are helping know what they are fighting for. Because the Taliban knew what they were fighting for and fought to the very end. And therefore, it's extremely important to also focus on the political conditions that are there. And this is what we see in Sahel as well. Finally, on crisis management, I hope that we will not see a shift of the pendulum from crisis management back to collective defense in the same way that in 2001 we saw it go from, the other way around. Because the two are large, I mean, they're different concepts, but they're largely inseparable strategically and politically. Mm-hmm. They're largely inseparable in terms of the kinds of capabilities. And I would say that crisis management is a way of forward collective defense. So if collective defense is reduced to exclusively defending your territory from within your territory, then I think that would be a deep mistake.
Thank you, Philippe. I'm a little surprised, actually, because I think we had long shifted from crisis management to territorial defense after 2014 and put a lot more emphasis on territorial defense, but maybe I am mistaken here. General, what is your basic takeaway from a Polish perspective looking at the Afghan mission, the end of it, American reliability, and I was asked by a journalist whether there was any comparison, like Afghanistan, Taiwan, and then maybe even NATO Article 5. And I said there is none, but maybe, do you agree with me or don't you?
So it's very, very interesting. We're sitting in Tallinn in the eastern flank, And talking about the NATO, mostly we're discussing about Afghanistan, even Taiwan, which is interesting. So we have a really global approach. But the first thing I would like to emphasize is what happened, what changed, Afghanistan for Polish army. Everything, absolutely everything. Poland made a very strategical, important 2 decisions the last 3 decades. I don't want to talk as a politician. I'm just telling you as a citizen of Poland. There was joining European Union and NATO, and it changed everything. Prosperity, economy, development, but in the security, significant change. So then we realized that we are obliged to go somewhere to defend, to be a part of the big architecture of security. That was the time I found out myself in Iraq and Afghanistan. So definitely, it was a huge change for Poland. And also, I would like to remind you that those days, the 70 years old institution, that the line between NATO and Warsaw Pact, the line between the Soviet Union and US troops mostly, NATO was 100 kilometers from here. It was a completely different world, completely different. So Tallinn was in a different space, different galactic. And, but also I'd like to say it's over. Holidays are over. So it's only interesting, sometimes emotional, memories, but this world is over. We have to spend much more money for security, invest a lot, because this is completely a different world today. And my biggest concern right now is how to describe, because we get used to use the terms like bipolar world, which was easy, black and white, 0-1, Soviet Union and NATO. There was no confrontation of economy. There was no confrontation of even ideology. There was no confrontation of economy. There was just only purely military confrontation, including nuclear assets. And then everything has changed completely. So we had a second in the history of mankind living in a unipolar world led by US. It was a holiday time, really. So US was responsible for everything, providing security also. And we get used to, and there's a need to ask ourselves, how about us? How much money or investments we would like to spend, not only asking for somebody else. And there's a question because as a military, and we have at least 3 generals here, 2 active duty, John Haram, the Chief of Lieutenant Estonian, unfortunately me, and Ben Hodges somewhere in the back as retired. And so the question is about the NATO, because the first point, the first challenge in the strategy of NATO is Russia. Full stop. So do we have, need to change the point 1 and talk about China, talk about Afghanistan, talk about Taiwan, or anything else, and then use the military assets for solving the problems, or you expecting some military advice, but it is not the proper order. So in democratic system.
Can I stay with this argument for a while? Because when you started, and now again you said, yeah, we talk about Afghanistan and the Indo-Pacific, but we are sitting here in Tallinn, and shouldn't it be about Russia and about the Russian threat? So my question to you is, are you afraid that with all these talks, also about climate change, about new technologies, do you think that NATO got distracted? And do you think that there is a widespread perception that basically we are done on the eastern flank? We have done so much after 2014, and so this is fixed. We just need to basically hold the line.
I think it is a matter of timing. In the big strategical perspective, climate change matters because effects will be soon, like food issues, water, Africa, and so on. But I really like yesterday in the backstage there was a house on fire, and there was a saying. One of the materials I got is if your neighbor's house is on fire, you have to take care. So there's a question, we're thinking about the climate change and something in the other side of a hill, or we're thinking about the fire, because we see the fire. So from eastern flank, from Polish perspective, Warsaw, and also from Tallinn perspective, we see the fire. So it's a matter of timing. So one day we should discuss about the what's going on in the future in 5 or 10 years, which is extremely difficult to describe because we're living in a compression of time, bombardment of info, cognitive, managing and all of the interesting terms that I'm reading every day. And at the same time, we have to solve the problems of today, because if you're thinking only about the climate change and you know to solve the problem that your neighbor's house is on fire, it is not, it is not a good approach from the military perspective.
Thank you very much. Maybe that is one of the rare occasions where a Polish and a French representative agree. So let's not focus too much on China within NATO. Philippe, coming to you, there was this press statement from President Macron right after the NATO summit in June, where Macron said something like, NATO, I have the quote here, like, NATO is an organization that concerns the North Atlantic. China has little to do with the North Atlantic, and we shouldn't confuse our goals, more or less. That's what he said. So listening to what the general said, do you think that we run into a problem here, that we focus too much on all sorts of things and that we now get distracted, focusing on China too much?
So I do think that NATO should focus, any organization should focus on what are the most salient challenges and threats, and in terms of action, those where it has the strongest value added. So if we reduce the discussion to NATO, I do think, as I said, that China as a direct military threat to the Euro-Atlantic area, if this is the prism under which we look at it, we're missing a big part of the picture. We do need to have that awareness. China is beginning to operate conventionally in our vicinity. There's the issue of Chinese-Russian military cooperation, including in our vicinity. But the key issue for us as Americans, as Europeans, as Canadians is, at least in the Euro-Atlantic area, the way in which China uses other tools, whether it's economic coercion, whether it's attempts to divide us, whether it's attempts to undermine our solidarity, our cohesion, by calling into question our solidarity. Look at the way it's acting with Lithuania. And the strongest reaction, the strongest way to react, and the most effective way to react has not been through NATO. It has been through EU solidarity with Lithuania, for example, in economic terms. And in terms of the issues, the domains, if you wish, if you look at commerce and technology, we have an EU-US dialogue on commerce and technology. It was a US proposal. This does not mean that the US cares less about NATO. It means that it knows and sees the EU's natural competencies in this domain. Mm-hmm. So I do not think that China should be at the forefront of what NATO is doing, or that NATO should be at the forefront of our response to Chinese actions. I do think that we need to work together, whether this is EU-US, EU-NATO, within NATO where it's the most relevant, and within the EU. Because what we have been doing over the last year and a half, I think has been extremely illustrative of what we are able to do at 27, even when we have divisions among member states, whether it be in terms of responding to Chinese vaccine or COVID diplomacy, and diplomacy is a polite word in terms of the way they put it, in terms of responding together to human rights violations, in terms of dealing with some of the issues like 5G or others, and looking forward, integrating all of this into an EU Indo-Pacific strategy that, of course, has to do with China, but that has to do even more with all of our partnerships in the region and with everything that the EU can offer as an alternative in terms of connectivity and other elements. So I think it would be a great mistake to put this in terms of the EU versus NATO. I think it's much more what we see and, more importantly, what we do as Europeans, Americans, and Canadians, regardless of the institution.
Thank you. I see Baiba nodding, but first I want to go to JJ, because I think a lot of Europeans these days try to figure out what the United States really want from Europe within NATO. I've heard a Spanish official speculating that basically the United States want NATO to become an alliance also focused on the Indo-Pacific. So if all Europeans here in the room, and you would need to advise us, do you think that there is really an expectation in Washington that Europeans and then also NATO should be more engaged and not only sending frigates like the Germans, the Bayern, but but just really engaged in the region? Do you think there is this expectation even?
Well, yes and no. But to get to your point, the question yes, Washington recognizes that it has a pretty big lift right now as far as that goes. There is this expectation that the EU, European countries, have a much larger role to play. If I hear what you're asking me, if I read between the lines, is the U.S. isolating itself to some degree?
That's what actually many Europeans fear. Many Europeans fear there is some sort of work share emerging. The US focuses on China. The Europeans, if they don't focus, and that there is some sort of decoupling emerging.
There could be some dark, sinister plan to do that none of us know about, and that wouldn't be unheard of. But I don't think that that's what's at play here, and I'll just be very brief with this. I think what's happening is we've heard the word distraction a bunch of times this morning, and a part of what the distraction is disinformation and misinformation, and it's deliberate. And one of the real problems in America is not understanding that that's what's happening. The echo chamber that we got that led to January 6th, some other things that took place in the run-up to January 6th, were all a part of this changing of the ground rules in America. People didn't realize disinformation was a part of that process. And so I think the US is not trying to pull back. I think it's actually trying to stand up on its skates again and get steady, before it starts doing anything significant worldwide. Because as Mr. Biden said before he was elected, because I was in Munich when he made that statement at the conference about America coming back, et cetera, and blah, blah, blah. I think that's what he's trying to do. But there's a lot of stuff to clean up before he gets there. And he's not there. With Afghanistan happening, that delayed that process. There's also this question about now, can we trust the Americans with, the consultation bit? There are just so many things that have been happening. Distractions have done a major job in confusing and muddling it. The cause of that distraction, I don't think, is getting enough attention. And I think that's a part of the reason why folks think America may want to isolate itself, but I don't really get that from talking to the folks that I've spoken to.
I think that is very reassuring for the Europeans in the room. Baiba, if you look at the discussions that you followed in NATO on China, but also on Russia, do you think that NATO got the balance right in June? And that, because I think Russia was mentioned more than 60 times and China much less so. So do you think that we are on the right track? And maybe also, Philippe brought this up 2 times, this cooperation between China and Russia. Is that very much on NATO's agenda as well?
On the communiqué and the language in communiqué, I think it really fairly reflects, again, what allies have come to regard as a common threat and also so-called emerging challenges assessment. And it's no surprise that China is indeed there in a much stronger ways than it was in London communiqué. And it doesn't mean that, there are practical sort of operational deterrence plans, but what it means is actually that the readiness, the thinking about it, the understanding of these threats and challenges has to be there. So, and this is where NATO's sort of relevance and value comes in, that we have to be able, again, through sharing the information, intelligence, the understanding of each other, what is relevant to all 30 allies, to be able to be ready for all threats and challenges, from nuclear deterrence to cyber and hybrid, and at different levels. And there will be different responses to different challenges. So the allies recently called out China through the Microsoft incident. It was the first statement of such kind on a cyber attack. So we are changing because the allies are changing. NATO is changing. We are getting, again, through the new strategic concept, through this discussion, through this free consultation, both on the military and civilian side of the houses, there will be a communality of the 30 to understand what are the next steps. And I don't want to prejudge it. There is a discussion ongoing, but again, we can't prejudge it. The real issue is, of course, it's about our societies. As JJ said, we know that both from the challenges during the COVID through the way the fragmentations, the bubbles, the sort of use of data was there by actors, malign actors, but also not so malign actors, just using the opportunities that the data is cheap, you can buy it, you can influence it, you know, you can influence groups, you can micro-target groups, that it provides such opportunities also for malign actors to undermine our societies, that it's actually, for us, for the allies, and for other democratic states based on the same values, democratic values, and the sort of liberal orders that we are, to understand on what rules do we function, how do we respond. If the regulation is not enough, do we need more regulation? It's very difficult. Whatever regulation comes, it's too late already. So that's why the resilience, the enhanced societal resilience concept, where essentially we think about sort of blockchain societies where there are nodes of groups, of families, of friends that actually understand and are able to sort of, at all levels, to choose the right response, whether, you know, from the smartphone to ending with the private sector and creating the right procedures of cyber hygiene and the rest. So it's a different type of realities that we are faced. The hybrid threats, be it cyber or disinformation, don't respect borders. There is no, you know, tank with a sign, you know, a cyber attack coming to us. It's just, you know, it's just there. And it undermines the very political essence of the consultation for us, you know, within NATO, to identify, to understand, and to respond. So the sort of, as more knowledge and ability to respond, that's the basis of the pyramid of the society of all allies, and not only allies. Here's where the partners come in, be it democracies all around the world. As better we understand, as better we share the information intelligence and are able to respond, especially on the what works, how to impose the costs, is the most efficient, I would say.
So you
got me going there.
I come to the audience immediately, but just before you think of your questions, you did not answer my question on China and Russia cooperating and a possible threat scenario, joint exercises near Europe. Is that something that worries NATO?
Let's say we are looking at it, and there are various angles to look at it, and there are certain things that are greatly exaggerated, and there are certain sort of points that are used for very much the situational use of one or the other country. So, you know, I will keep it at that.
So I already have so many hands. We collect, I guess, 4, and keep your questions precise. I have to start with Linas Linkevicius over there.
Thanks a lot. On this pull-out from Afghanistan, the very fact it's understandable and it should happen somehow, but the way it was done probably difficult to call as a success, and would be a big mistake now to deny that, by the way. But it's also what concerns me, also temptation to isolate from Americans and to act autonomously. Again, these voices coming up. And yesterday, Vice President of Commission, Shinas, tried to advertise strategic autonomy. In my view, it was not very convincing. Also, there are some other initiatives, and I believe, especially now, we have to take this challenge together. We shouldn't allow to split alliance, to make it, you know, even more problematic. We have to address jointly and as a lessons, and really look forward and craft all these initiatives on both sides of the ocean very carefully. And have in mind some ideas of European army, which were discussed before. Few knows what that means, by the way. Or strategic autonomy, again. So even if it says that it's nothing to do with isolation, but it smells like isolation, which is also dangerous, I believe. It should be really a different way. So my question will be maybe to Philippe, maybe you can try to justify this idea of strategic autonomy in particular. And Baiba, if you can tell something how it was discussed in NATO, if it's discussed, and what could be the opinion. Others also welcome if they will be willing to comment. Thank you.
I think you can give the mic to the lady next to you, yeah. And I think there is no greater pleasure for a French diplomat than to explain strategic autonomy and why we all get it wrong. So looking forward to this. Yeah, I take a couple of questions and then I come back to you. Please.
Thank you so much. My name is Lolita Sigana. I'm from Riga, Latvia. I would like to ask the panelists to go a bit deeper into the regional migration crisis that we are having on Lithuania, Belarus, and Latvia-Belarus border. Philippe mentioned that the European Union has stepped in, but isn't there really an Article 5 dimension too that we should analyze in this respect? Thank you.
Mr. Ilves here, and then, yeah, I come to you, and then I give it back to the panel for quick answers.
Yes, 20 years ago when I was foreign minister, my all-consuming task was to join NATO for Estonia because of the regional security aspects of it. Since 2007, I think it should be quite clear that the age of kinetic warfare is considerably diminished, and geography, as in North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the raison d'etre for that is not anything other than tank logistics, bomber range, fighter fueling. War today, attacks today, there is no distance, there is no time for all intents and purpose on Earth, at least. Point is that the response of both the European Union and NATO to digital threats is woefully inadequate. I mean, having a center of excellence in Riga and Tallinn for Stratcom and cyber is nice, but that is not an adequate response to the kinds of threats we face today. And I would say the same thing is true of the European Union, alas, which I don't understand why they don't focus more on the digital side, because PESCO, we don't need arguments about whose tanks are these. EU is ideally suited for dealing in a big way with security on the digital side, or the non-kinetic aspect of it. Both of them are, as I said, woefully inadequate. And are there plans to actually do something serious in this regard? Because China is not a distant neighbor when we are in the digital world. They're right here.
I think that's a question to you, Baiba, and last, Sabine Fischer, and then we do a second and a third, and hopefully also a fourth round. Over there.
Well,
yeah?
Where's Sabine?
Sabine is 2 rows behind you. Yeah, of course.
Because I'm not Sabine Fischer.
But there is only one Sabine Fischer. She's one of the leading Russia experts in Germany.
I'm not so sure about that, but okay. Yeah, Sabine Fischer from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin. And indeed, I'm one of the Russia watchers in this wonderful crowd. And so I'll ask a Russia question with regard to Afghanistan, because obviously what is happening there now is watched very closely from Moscow. And there's a lot of triumphalism, as we know, and posturing. But if you scratch the surface a little bit, you will see that there's a lot of concern as well about the security risks that are emanating from the situation in Afghanistan for the Central Asian allies of Russia, but also for Russia itself. So my question is, do you see any space, any possibility to communicate about this with Russia, against the background of what was just discussed on the panel about Russia being an imminent threat to NATO, actually? So any possibility to communicate, even cooperate with Russia about this situation, or is the gap between the sides too deep for this to happen? Thank you.
Okay, so we have strategic autonomy and European isolationism, the regional migration crisis as means of hybrid warfare, Article 5, digital aspects, us being inadequately equipped, and the possibility for cooperation with Russia. And I ask you to be maybe very short, so you have seen there are 50 people who want to come in. Philippe, maybe you start.
So on strategic autonomy, I think, Linus, that we can disagree on the words. That makes diplomats' business interesting and challenging. What's most important is that we agree on what we do. And when I look at what Europeans, I'm not saying NATO, EU, what I'm looking at what Europeans do in terms of taking on greater defense responsibilities, in terms of greater capabilities, in terms of intervening in the higher end of the spectrum further from Europe. If you look at the Task Force Takuba in the Sahel, what we are doing is taking on more responsibility, and luckily so, in areas that de facto, and this doesn't say anything about the end of NATO, about US isolationism, about Europe pushing away the US. De facto, the US says it's important, but it's not that important to us. We're very happy to support, and they give key support, but we don't want to be in the lead. And I think the more we're able to do this, the more we're able to do it in NATO, in the EU, in ad hoc formats, just among Europeans with US support or among Europeans with the US, then the more we will both make the alliance in the sort of the concept, an alliance, a transatlantic alliance, vibrant and sustainable, including in the US domestic politics and body politic, and the more we will be able to not be taken by surprise when there's something happening in our neighborhood to the south or in the Middle East, where the US simply does not want to intervene, because we cannot be dependent on this. And I think this is not, it should not be divisive. It isn't in practice. So if it is in theory, it's not that bad.
Baiba.
On cooperation with the EU, I haven't seen a closer cooperation with the EU than NATO has had than now. It's literally everyday exchange of information, and in my sphere also on digital, on countering disinformation, on everything that is there. NATO has adopted its own artificial intelligence strategy. We're discussing data exploitation framework. There's a whole sort of set of work that is ongoing both on the political and civilian and military sides of the house. And we work with the EU on an everyday basis. So in that respect, the channels of communication, but also externally with the External Action Service, with regard to third countries, what Chinese disinformation or misinformation operations are, what Russians are doing, and so on and so forth. So that is all happening. It's not everything is public, obviously, on substance. On military capabilities, there is, as we know, for the 30 allies, there's usually one set of capabilities. And of course, when we look at the numbers, it's pretty clear that 70% of GDP in NATO is from non-NATO allies, and 80% of defense spending within NATO comes from non-EU allies. So that's just to put things in perspective where the capabilities really are. Having said that, the defense spending has risen. The investment in research and development has risen across the alliance. So we are moving in the right way also in terms of these harder capabilities, but also in terms of digital, as Thomas was saying. So I don't know what is adequate or inadequate. I think we all can have personal opinions, but having been in the alliance now for 1.5 years, I can say that we have advanced from where we were when I arrived to now, and it's not because of me, sorry, but it's just there. And that's because allies, all 30, have really made huge jumps. And I think it has been due to the COVID, the whole digital proximity of reality, or what it means for our democracies has, and for our private sector has really increased that will to cooperate. But also on countering hybrid as such, the whole sort of hybrid response options that we have as in NATO, and where again with the EU, we are just the most natural partners. It's all there. There's, it's, yeah.
That's very abstract.
I don't want to say, counter that strategic autonomy is a choice of words, and what is the meaning. We can, again, insert something else. But the reality is we work very closely together.
But coming back to the hybrid warfare question, if I may call it as such, do you think that particular case is a case for NATO?
NATO has just deployed the counter-hybrid support team to Lithuania, actually. So, there was a very quick decision by 30 allies. It was literally, short discussion and it was done. So, again, it will be a very practical work done on the ground in Lithuania. It's not discussed within the Article 5 notion. That is not done because there hasn't been request for anything like that. But it's just the early response options that Lithuania has asked for. So,
thank you. General, maybe you're the least possible person who would advocate for cooperating with Russia, I would assume. But coming back to...
Not only because I'm a general, but also because I'm Polish.
Russia and Afghanistan.
But coming back to the question on Russia and Afghanistan more precisely, isn't there a rationale behind what Sabine Fischer has said? Is there room for cooperation because we we share actually an interest?
As a human being, I would say just to discuss is always nice. So there's not a problem just to discuss. It was a question about our will and our agenda, of course. I think right now in Afghanistan, what we observe is Russia trying to put some footprint and looking for some place of opportunity. So the Russian embassy is still working. And in a very short term, they playing a game that it's success because they're still staying and pretending to influence the situation. And also, which is interesting linkage, that's my private perspective, is a situation in Afghanistan. And then we have illegal immigration with some kind of Aeroflot airplane support, flying those poor people, transporting to Belarus, and then finally to the Lithuanian, Latvian, and the Polish border, ends up at exercise. But in the long term, Russians, they know very well that it's a huge challenge and problem for Russia, because if the situation in Afghanistan is destabilized, those people on the road are going to the certain boundaries of Russia. So it's very short-term success or success-like event they try to explore, but in the long term there will be a huge problem. So that would be a reason from some certain identities like a NATO or European Union or coalitions to talk and to discuss. But direct discussion, to be honest, between Poland and Russia in such a case, it will be extremely challenging. That's the most diplomatic word I would use.
Thank you very much. JJ, very quickly. I have a lot of people waiting.
I just wanted to say that this is what I was getting at earlier when I said Afghanistan changes everything. Because I think Russia, according to several sources that I've been speaking to since this whole thing was unfolding, expected the U.S. the plan to work. Equip them, they stand up, do what they need to do, and Russia continued to try to tear down, play the role of spoiler in the background, while the U.S. and NATO did the hard, dirty work. They didn't expect what took place to take place. Now Russia recognizes it too is threatened. So now they're not sure how to handle this. So there may be room for a discussion. Where it goes, I don't know. But I don't think that Russia's looking at this, based on the folks that I've spoken to, the same way they were looking at it before everything just broke down in Afghanistan.
Okay. I now go to Konstantin and Sven. Second row to my left. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. Konstantin Eggert, I have a very brief journalistic question to every participant, every panelist. And it is quite simple. After the Afghanistan debacle that we've seen in the last few weeks, whether it's a real or perceived PR debacle, we're not discussing that now. Is the American leadership of NATO, is it weakened?
Thank you. Sven.
Thank you. Sven Sakkava, I am Ambassador of Estonia to Finland. My question is in the same direction as Elina Slinkiewicz's one in the previous panel, or previous round. And really, Philippe, I heard what you say that we should not charge the last 20 years according to what happened in the last 20 days. There's a problem with that argumentation when you follow football, for example. You can have a very good 88 minutes. But if the two are really bad, then the final score is not the one what you wished for. Now, if we've summarized the collective worries what we have about the nature of a withdrawal from Afghanistan, I think it's threefold. How it affects U.S. self-confidence, to engage in the world. Secondly, how it affects allies, friends of the United States. In Europe, I think the worry in this part of Europe is that there are renewed calls, and we already heard them, for European strategic autonomy, European sovereignty, but the calls will remain inside the realm of speeches and declarations, not military spending and capabilities. And the third worry is, of course, emboldening the adversaries. My question to the panelists is, what needs to be done in order to remedy those 3 points?
Thank you, making it a very big question. The lady next to Sergei Utkin, and then Sergei Utkin.
Thank you, Yulia Nikitina, MGIMO University, Russia. So I have a question about NATO's evolution in the future. So if we look at the picture chosen by the organizers to illustrate this panel, I wonder, is it the US on the right side making a sophisticated jump and hoping for support from European allies? So that's what we have discussed in this panel. But if you had to give your personal perspective on NATO, in the future. So it used to be a military bloc, now it's a political organization. What will it be in the future? What should it be in the future? A family, as JJ said, or a global police, or something else? Very brief definition, just a couple of words from each of the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we leave that as a very last question, so that will be kind of your concluding sentence to finish the sentence, what will NATO be in the future? We park this. Sergei.
My question actually rhymes with the question of Yulia, but on a more concrete level. Philippe Errera just mentioned the French involvement in Sahel and the French responsibility there, but it looks like that the French operation, the Barkhane, it is also heading towards a defeat by the end of this year. Most people say that Africa is not NATO business, but is it like forever to remain this way? My question on that is twofold. First, to Philippe Errera, did you feel like you didn't have sufficient support from the allies or maybe NATO mechanisms, assets that you could have used and that could have made the operation more successful? Did you feel this gap, that wasn't the NATO mission there? And to Baiba, Braže, whether you do at all have any discussion on Africa in NATO. Is it like the discussion is there but there is no consensus, or there is no discussion at all?
Thank you. I take one more. I would love to take a woman, actually, to have kind of some sort of gender balance. There's no woman, so tant pis. Gentleman in the third row.
Thank you. First of all, I want to say thank you to General Andrzejczak for this.
Could you introduce yourself first?
Anton Drobovich, head of Ukrainian Institute of National Remembrance, about this vision in East Europe, because fire in our home, in Ukraine, in Georgia, in Belarus, and we have smoke in the Lithuania. My question to Baiba and to JJ. When we look into the stories about Afghanistan, get the impression that different countries are coming out from Afghanistan, not coalition. Is this random media effect or our East European vision, lack of communication, or some new challenge of coordination in NATO? Thank you.
Okay. Do you want to answer, or shall I take one more? Do you think you can deal with one more question? Yeah. So, still no lady. Sorry, ladies.
Where are the women?
Over the gentleman over there, and then Carsten, I come to you, and then I think.
Hello, I'm Shota Guineria from Baltic Defense College and EPRC Georgia. Listening to this panel, I conceived this crazy question about the open door policy of NATO. You know, nobody mentioned it. ASG mentioned sort of cooperative security as one of the three main pillars of NATO. But what about the open door policy? Because when Biden was elected, different nations had different hopes and expectations. And in Georgia and in Ukraine, we definitely had some expectations that our Euro integration process somehow could move forward with the new administration. But now with everything happening and with all these fires around us, is open door policy still a policy, or it's a myth, actually?
Thank you very much. And Carsten Fries, first row.
Thank you, and thank you, Jana, for letting me speak. We discussed last night, JJ, and you said Afghanistan changes everything. I will pose to you, Afghanistan changes nothing. It's a bump in the road for NATO. That's the argument I gave last night, so I'll share it with you now. For two reasons. Politically, we all, to be a little bit cynical, fed up. We want to get out of there. Therefore, there will not be enough to play, because we don't want to deal with this. Secondly, militarily, NATO has been focused on collective defense since 2014. That's what we do. And that brings me to my question. These three core tasks of NATO, they seem equal on paper, but in reality, what NATO does is military planning on collective defense. All the strategies that have been made in recent years in shape has been about collective defense. So should we rethink how we phrase these three core tasks, especially the two other ones, in that context?
Thank you. So now you have difficult choices. You have to choose which question you answer. But JJ, you definitely need to answer the question on American leadership being weaker after Afghanistan.
What was that question, actually?
I think the question was whether after Afghanistan, the takeaway, or whether American leadership was weakened in NATO, but maybe also globally.
Yes and no. In the moment, it was. But as all of you know, what happens in the moment does not mean that it's etched in history. There's the possibility of recapacitating. There is such a thing. Sven mentioned the football metaphor. There is such a thing as an equalizer. Where that comes, how it comes, I don't know. But I don't think that anybody's just going to say, forget it, we lost it, all hope is gone, American leadership is destroyed, or, you know, this was a setback, no doubt. But there were some shining moments, and I think that when the American leadership gets a chance, the opportunity will present itself to reassert itself and reestablish that it can lead. But I think what they really want to do right now is to lead together with NATO and the rest of the world that is aligned ideologically with the US.
Thank you. General.
There was plenty of very interesting the questions, but I would like to touch some of them. First was about Article 5 and the situation on the border. Some of the ladies you mentioned was very interesting. Let's stop for a while and imagine the situation. You have a 40 million country with a 100,000 army, 100,000 police, and 30 immigrants in the border, Polish, Belarusian border, and we would like to introduce Article 5. It's crazy. But at the same time, we're living in a completely different dimension. I spent a couple of days talking to my political leadership, my bosses, about the situation. So we fully control it, physically, operationally, we control the situation. Well, of course, a lot of challenges right now, but we're controlling. But we're losing perceptional battle. So the question about the Zapad exercise is very interesting for you. I don't want to, I'm waiting for the answer, but let's ask ourselves right now. Somebody says the Zapad exercise is in a hot phase right now because the immigration from Afghanistan through the Belarus, making unrest and using hybrid-like scenario is probably the first phase of exercise Zapad. And the active phase will be in a couple of days. Or maybe the Zapad is over because the Russians, they achieved their strategical objectives. They're criticizing Americans and NATO. An entire discussion today is about we are not effective enough. So it's a matter of the measurement. What's the measurement of victory in Afghanistan? That was also in the previous panel, very interesting. Is it our flag in the Iwo Jima somewhere, or is it just the conditions we're building? So probably our vocabulary, we have to calibrate a little bit. And I don't think this Article 5 will be good enough. Maybe we'll feel better, but we still have enough assets, not necessarily military ones. And also very interesting, the comments about the end of age of kinetic warfare. Mm-hmm. Well, sir, it's painful for me because I'm armor. I spend most of my time in armor. But I have to agree that absolutely the proportions, comparing the kinetic assets and also facing to the problems and the crises we use today, probably are not fit enough. And in the digital threat, which is, I like it very much, the space and time. So it means we're living in a different dimension of space because China somehow is not in the other side of the globe. Most of you have Huawei telephones right now on. So China is here. China is not in the other side of the globe. So the calibrating the terms and vocabulary will be very important. If not, our discussion will have the different conclusions.
Baiba.
On the US leadership of NATO, if it's weakened, again, when President Trump was in the office, everybody thought it's the end of NATO. Now everybody again says there's a new crisis. But actually what you see in reality is that the US has never consulted as much. There is a, at all levels, be it at experts level, on nuclear posture review, on presidential level, defense secretary, and so on and so forth, both defense and foreign secretaries were there. So it's like an everyday relationship. So I wouldn't say it's weakened. And as you heard, there are different perspectives to look at Afghanistan. But one thing is clear, we have to learn, or at least try to learn those lessons, because scenarios were there. So which ones did the Allies choose? And to say about the evacuations, that it looked that the countries were running the operations. Actually, NATO was coordinating the evacuations, especially for those allies that didn't have embassies on the ground. So it was NATO that was literally getting the information on the evacuees, on the nationals, on the Afghans, exchanging it with our operations cell in NATO and pulling that information together. It was really 24/7 work for several weeks, and it was. I think we did what we could, and we do expect the airport to stay open, and there are still people that we would like to get out, and we will work towards that. But it was NATO coordinating it largely, and the allies were great, really. The military stepped up, and as Philippe said, some were readier, some were less ready, but the work was being done. Then on the future, NATO statute provides it's a political military alliance. It is a political military alliance. The work that we are doing is very much around situational awareness and understanding, increasing the understanding and readiness. So the investment that is put both in tech within NATO, be it on the military or civilian side, to increase that awareness, to have the information environment, the indicators and warnings there, to understand them, and then how to interpret them, to have the right political and military decisions and the military advice on which we can base political decision. It's all happening as we speak. So in that respect, indeed, the tech and data provides new challenges, and the digital aspect of not having that warning time is both a threat but also an opportunity. So actually, having learned the lessons from the invasion in Ukraine by Russia in 2014, this April we were able to see and understand much better what was happening, what was there. And also we saw that Ukrainians had learned those lessons, and actually, speaking about the open door, be it on Ukraine or Georgia or other countries, it's a decision for the 30 allies in those countries. Nothing has changed. It's the open door. And of course, the candidate countries who want to enter NATO do have to continue invest in their capabilities, reforms, so that the allies at 30 can make those decisions. And it's an ongoing process. It's just there.
I'm afraid we are running out of time, Baiba.
It's the core tasks, strategic concept. It will remain. I mean, the core tasks, again, it will be fulfilled with a sort of evolving substance, again. But the core tasks, how we formulate them, are not going to disappear.
All three of them. Philippe.
Sorry.
Three very quick points. First, in response to Sven's question, I did not say that that the result should be seen as only in the prism of what we did over the last 20 years. The result was a failure. And it's like at the end of the soccer match, what matters is the score. But what I was saying is that when we do carry out our lessons learned exercise, we need to think about the choices we made collectively over the last 20 years to see at what point we could and should have done things differently. And when you come to the debate on strategic autonomy, etc., I separate this from the EU issue. Of course, we're going to have a very ambitious EU-French presidency on issues related to security and defense, among others. But I'm struck to see even the debate within the UK after Afghanistan, where people ask themselves, do we want to be in this situation again? And if we don't, then what should we do in terms of relations with the US? And so I think we can and we should have this serious debate, even if it's a difficult debate, because we will come out stronger and more united. Second point, in terms of the question regarding Africa and NATO and trench operations in Sahel. I won't surprise you, and it's not only because I'm French, it's also just because I look on the facts at the ground. I would not say Barkhane is a failure and this failure will be seen by the end of the year. What I am saying, and what the French president has said with the partners who are on the ground with us, is that it's increasingly difficult and that it's changing in nature. And that therefore the counterterrorism dimension of it per se is taking, in a sense, a less salient role compared to building up of partner forces, building up of state sovereignty, etc. And in this regard, I think that the question isn't so much why NATO as an organization is there or isn't there. We've made the collective choice not to use NATO. But when we have Estonian forces that were in Barkhane as early as 2018, Estonia was the first country to actually be on the ground. We had got key support from other countries, logistically, et cetera, but Estonia was the first country. I think that if we were able to operate so closely with them and so efficiently, and even more so today with all of the special operations forces working in the higher end of the spectrum in Takuba, it's thanks to the interoperability we have within NATO. So it's not because NATO as an organization is not somewhere that it isn't providing value.
So as a final exercise, finish the sentence. What will NATO be in the future? NATO will in the future be?
Here.
General?
Successful, effective.
Baiba?
Able to respond to all threats from nuclear to hybrid.
And Philippe?
It will be what we decide for it to be and what we prepare ourselves as nations to be able to commit to doing together within NATO.
Thank you very much. That was it from my side. Enjoy your meal. Thank you to the panelists.